The dialysis machine screamed, its alarm piercing the sterile hospital air. I swung my IV pole like a weapon, crushing a mercenary's wrist as he lunged. Julian moved faster, his hands a blur of violence. But the real betrayal wasn't the masked men. It was Sarah, my assistant, slipping a check into her pocket. The recorder in my palm held the truth, but the smoke was rising, and I was running out of time. The empire, my life, all of it, gone in 30 seconds. The rhythmic hiss of the dialysis machine pulsed through the sterile suite, a mechanical heartbeat mocking Arthur Sterling's own sluggish pulse. Plastic tubing, warm and slick against his forearm, snaked toward the heavy console. He gripped the adjustable bed rail, his knuckles prominent beneath skin, thin as parchment. The air carried the sharp, acidic sting of antiseptic and the faint, burnt sugar scent of Julian's expensive cologne. Arthur shifted his gaze from the window, where the Chicago skyline was a jagged silhouette against a bruised twilight sky, to the man standing at the foot of his bed. Julian didn't knock. He never did. He stepped into the light, his tailored charcoal suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the pale green walls. He tossed a thick sheaf of papers onto Arthur's lap. The weight pressed against Arthur's thighs, a physical burden he lacked the strength to shove away. "Read the third clause, brother." Julian's voice lacked its usual oily charm, replaced by a flat, metallic edge. Arthur fumbled for his spectacles on the bedside table. His fingers brushed a lukewarm cup of water, nearly toppling it before he secured the frames. Through the glass, the legal jargon blurred into a jagged swarm of black ink. "Total power of attorney," Arthur rasped. His throat scorched with every word, feeling as though he'd swallowed hot sand. "You want the board seats, the logistics hubs, everything." Julian leaned over the bed, his shadow swallowing Arthur's legs. He pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and clicked it. One sharp snap echoed off the linoleum. "My kidney is a perfect match, Arthur. The surgeons are on standby. But I won't cut myself open for a man who treats me like a line item on a balance sheet. Sign the empire over, or stay tethered to that humming box until it's the only thing left of you." Arthur stared at the signature line. The machine hissed again, a steady, indifferent reminder of his expiration date. He looked at his wrist, his fingers automatically finding the radial artery. He began to count. 1, 2, 3. He needed to reach 12 to feel grounded. But the weight of the pen Julian thrust toward him broke the rhythm. "You're asking me to die before I'm dead," Arthur whispered. "I'm asking you to retire," Julian countered, his signet ring tapping a rhythmic, annoying beat against the metal bed rail. Clink, clink, clink. Sterling Holdings needs a heart that actually pumps blood, not a calculator in a hospital gown. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the medicinal smell of the room and the distant wail of a siren on Michigan Avenue. Arthur looked at the door, hoping for a distraction, but the hallway remained still. He was a king in a cage of glass and chrome, and his jailer was his own flesh and blood. Suddenly, the hushed atmosphere of the private wing shattered. A heavy thud echoed from the corridor, followed by the sharp, splintering sound of wood. Arthur's head snapped toward the door. Two men, faces obscured by dark, tactical masks, burst into the suite. They didn't look like thieves. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace. The air in the room suddenly turned cold, the scent of ozone and sweat replacing the bleach. "Julian," Arthur barked, though the sound came out as a weak wheeze. One of the intruders lunged toward the bed, a glint of dull metal in his hand. Arthur's mind, honed by decades of split-second market decisions, didn't freeze. He reached for the only weapon within his grasp, his heavy, stainless steel IV pole. With a grunt of pure, adrenaline-fueled agony, he swung the pole outward. The base waited for stability, caught the first man across the shins. There was a sickening crack, and the assailant tumbled forward, his head hitting the edge of the dialysis machine with a hollow thud. Julian, surprisingly, didn't flee. He stepped into the path of the second man, his predatory energy finally finding a physical outlet. He didn't fight like a gentleman. He fought like a man who had spent his life waiting for a reason to break something. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisting it until the bone groaned, then drove a shoulder into the man's chest, pinning him against the wall. "Who sent you?" Julian hissed, his face inches from the mask. The man struggled, but Julian's grip was like a vice. Arthur watched, breathless, as his brother slammed the man's head against the wall once, twice, until the intruder went limp. Julian let the body slide to the floor and immediately turned to the door, throwing the heavy deadbolt. "Security is on the way," Julian said, his breathing barely elevated. He adjusted his tie, his fingers steady. "It seems our rivals are getting impatient for your seat, Arthur." Arthur sat back, his chest heaving. His side ached where the tubes entered his body, a sharp, stabbing heat. He looked at the two unconscious men on the floor, then back at Julian. For a moment, a flicker of something resembling gratitude stirred in his chest. But it was quickly extinguished by the cold reality of their situation. Julian hadn't saved him out of love. He had saved his investment. As Julian moved to the window to check the street below, Arthur's hand trembled beneath the sheets. He felt for the small, slim digital recorder he kept tucked into the side of his mattress, a habit from years of paranoid board meetings. With a silent click, he activated the device. Julian turned back, his eyes scanning the room. He walked over to the bed, stepping over the first intruder as if he were a piece of discarded luggage. He leaned down, believing Arthur was slipping into a shock-induced stupor. "You see, Arthur?" Julian whispered, his voice low and venomous. "This is why you're finished. You're a target. Once I have the signature, I'm going to tear this company down to the studs. I'm selling the Chicago towers to Thompson's Group. I'm liquidating the pension funds. By the time I'm done, the name Sterling won't be a legacy. It'll be a memory of a fire." Arthur kept his eyes closed, his heart hammering against his ribs. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted the beats, using the rhythm to keep his breathing shallow and even. He had it. The confession was spinning onto the tiny internal drive. Leverage. A way to burn Julian's bridge before he could cross it. "I'll leave you the house in the Hamptons," Julian added with a mocking softness. "You can count your steps on the beach until the tide takes you." Julian straightened up and walked toward the door as security finally began pounding from the outside. Arthur felt a surge of cold triumph. He had the truth. He had the weapon. But as the door was kicked open by the hospital's armed response team, Julian paused. He didn't look at the guards. He looked back at the bed, specifically at the slight bulge in the bedding where the recorder lay. A slow, terrifying smile spread across Julian's face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, Arthur," Julian said, loud enough for the guards to hear. "I hope you got all that. It's important to have a script for the end of the world, isn't it?" The realization hit Arthur like a physical blow. Julian had seen the recorder. The entire confession had been a performance, a false trail designed to make Arthur feel secure in a weapon that Julian likely already had a countermove for. The hope that had flared in Arthur's chest turned to ash. He hadn't gained leverage. He had been baited into a trap of false confidence. The room flooded with guards and nurses. In the chaos, Arthur saw a familiar shock of silver-blonde hair. Sarah Miller, his assistant of 5 years, pushed through the crowd. Her face was a mask of professional concern, her hands fluttering as she approached the bed. "Oh, Mr. Sterling, are you all right? I heard the noise and I'm so sorry. I should have been here," she stammered, her voice thin and wavering. She reached out to adjust his pillow, her touch light and practiced. Arthur looked at her, searching for the loyalty he had relied on for half a decade. "Sarah," he managed to choke out, "get the files from my safe. We need to alert the board." "Of course, sir. Immediately." "I'm so sorry," she said, bowing her head in that submissive way she always did. She turned to leave, but as she passed through the doorway, Julian was waiting. Arthur watched through the gap in the privacy curtain. He saw Julian reach into his pocket and pull out a thick, legal-sized envelope. It was heavy, bulging with the unmistakable shape of cash. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't look around. She took the envelope and slid it into her oversized leather tote bag with a practiced, fluid motion. She looked up at Julian, and for a split second, the professionally bland mask dropped. There was no apology in her eyes, only a cold, calculating hunger that mirrored Julian's own. Arthur felt the world tilt. The bleach smell in the room became suffocating, a chemical cloud that burned his lungs. He was alone. His brother was a predator, his assistant was a spy, and his body was a failing machine. He looked at his wrist, his fingers searching for the pulse that felt more like a fading echo every second. 10, 11, 12. He reached the end of his count, but for the first time in 40 years, it brought no peace. The rhythm was broken. The hospital lights flickered, a momentary dip in power as the facility's backup generators hummed to life. In the dimness, the dialysis machine's red warning light blinked like a steady, accusing eye. "Prep him for the theater," a doctor barked, his voice muffled by a surgical mask. "His numbers are bottoming out. We go now, or we don't go at all." Arthur felt the bed begin to move. The wheels squeaked against the linoleum, a high-pitched, rhythmic screaming. He looked up at the ceiling tiles, counting them as they blurred past. 1, 2, 3. He was being wheeled toward a gamble where the stakes were his soul, and the house, run by Julian, always won. The operating room was a cathedral of cold steel and blinding white light. The air was frigid, designed to keep bacteria at bay and the surgeons sharp. Arthur felt the scratchy texture of the surgical cap on his head, the sharp prick of a needle in the back of his hand. "Count backward from 10, mister." "10. Sterling," the anesthesiologist said, her voice a calm, distant melody. Arthur looked up at the observation gallery. Behind the glass, Julian stood alone. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was watching with the intense, unblinking focus of a man watching a stock ticker. He looked into Arthur's eyes and tapped his signet ring against the glass. Clink, clink, clink. 10, Arthur thought. 9, 8. The darkness didn't come all at once. It drifted in like a black tide, cold and indifferent. His last thought before the void took him wasn't of his company, or his father, or the billions he had amassed. It was of the yellow rain boot he had seen in the hallway. A bright, senseless splash of color in a world that was rapidly turning to gray. When the world returned, it was through a haze of pain and the heavy, wet sensation of 1,000 needles stitching his side. Arthur's eyes fluttered open. The ceiling was different, vivid white, with tiny perforations. He was in the ICU. His hand moved instinctively to his side. A thick bandage covered the area where his brother's kidney now lived. He felt a strange, heavy warmth there, a foreign presence that pulsated with a rhythm that wasn't his own. He was alive. But the silence of the room was wrong. Usually Sarah would be there with a briefing, or Michael Davis, the CFO, would be hovering with a tablet. Instead, there was only the flickering glow of a television mounted on the wall. The volume was low, but the image was unmistakable. Julian was standing on a podium in front of the Sterling Holdings headquarters. A ticker ran across the bottom of the screen. CEO Julian Sterling announces mass restructuring. Veteran board dismissed. Arthur tried to reach for the remote, but his arm felt like lead. He could only watch as Julian, looking refreshed and triumphant, spoke into a forest of microphones. "The old guard has served its purpose," Julian said, his voice smooth and serpentine through the tiny speakers. "But today, we prune the dead wood. We are liquidating the manufacturing sector. The Gary, Indiana plant, our father's first acquisition, will be shuttered by Friday. We are moving toward a leaner, more agile future." Arthur's heart gave a painful lurch. The Gary plant wasn't just an asset. It was the foundation. It employed 4,000 people. It was the only thing left that still carried their father's touch. Julian wasn't restructuring. He was amputating. Arthur forced his fingers to move, inching toward the bedside table where a smuggled tablet lay hidden beneath a stack of medical journals. Michael Davis had left it there before the surgery, a final act of defiance. With trembling hands, Arthur tapped in his master encryption code. He needed to get into the primary servers, to trigger the dead man switch he had installed years ago, a sequence that would freeze all corporate assets in the event of a hostile takeover. The screen glowed blue. Accessing. Arthur held his breath. If he could just lock the accounts, the liquidation would stall. Julian wouldn't be able to sign the transfer papers for the Gary plant. He'd be a king with no gold. Password accepted. A surge of adrenaline hit Arthur's system. He moved through the menus, his mind sharp despite the fog of painkillers. He reached the final confirmation screen. Execute lockdown? He pressed the icon. Suddenly, the screen turned a violent, flashing red. A siren-like wail erupted from the tablet's tiny speakers, and a message appeared in bold, black letters. Credentials revoked. Security Protocol Delta initiated. Arthur stared in horror. A progress bar appeared. Wiping system. 10%. 30%. No. Arthur rasped, his voice cracking. No, no, no. The tablet was no longer a tool. It was a beacon. By attempting to use his old codes, he had triggered a quarantine that Julian's new security team had clearly installed while Arthur was under the knife. The system wasn't just locking him out. It was identifying every hidden account, every offshore shadow fund he had spent decades building, and flagging them for internal audit. The screen went black. A small icon of a ghost appeared in the center, Julian's signature. Arthur let the tablet slip from his numb fingers. He had tried to be the engine, just as his father had taught him. He had tried to outmaneuver the predator with logic and hidden doors. But Julian hadn't just changed the locks. He had rebuilt the house while Arthur slept. The door to the ICU suite pushed open. Julian walked in, still wearing the suit from the television broadcast. He looked down at the black tablet on the floor, and then at Arthur's pale, sweating face. "You always were too predictable, Arthur," Julian said, stepping closer. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a teacher with a failing student. "You think in lines and grids. I think in vacuums. You left a trail of breadcrumbs right to your private reserves. Thank you for that. It saved my accountants weeks of digging. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial and a syringe. The liquid inside was clear, viscous. The doctors say you're experiencing post-operative agitation, Julian said, his voice dropping to a soothing, terrifying whisper. It's very common. A little something to help you rest, to keep you quiet while I finish the paperwork. Julian signaled to the hallway, and a man in a security uniform stepped in. It was Richard Evans, the guard with the raw cuticles. He looked at Arthur, then at the floor, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and greed. Hold his arm, Richard, Julian commanded. Richard moved forward, his large hands trembling. I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, he whispered to the bed frame as he reached for Arthur's PICC line. Sorry, bed. Sorry, sir. Arthur felt a cold flare of terror. He knew what was in that syringe. It wasn't just a sedative, it was a cage. If they put him under now, he would wake up in a world where the Sterling name was a punchline. As Richard's heavy hand clamped down on his forearm, Arthur's fingers brushed against something hard and cold on the bedside tray. A surgical scalpel left behind by a hurried nurse during a dressing change. He didn't think. He didn't count. He simply gripped the plastic handle and swung. The blade was incredibly sharp. It sliced through the polyester of Richard's sleeve and into the meat of his forearm. Richard let out a strangled yelp, his grip loosening as a bright spray of red hit the white sheets. He cut me! The old man cut me! Richard scrambled back, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with shock. Julian froze, the syringe halfway to the IV port. For the first time, the composure cracked. His eyes darted from the bleeding guard to Arthur, who was now sitting up, the scalpel held out like a jagged tooth. Stay back, Arthur hissed, his chest burning, his stitches feeling as though they were being unzipped from the inside. I will bleed out on this floor before I let you touch me again. Julian stared at him, his lip curling in a snarl. He looked at the syringe, then at the door, hearing the heavy footsteps of real medical staff approaching, drawn by Richard's shout. This doesn't change the math, Arthur, Julian said, backing away. You're a dying man in a sinking ship. Enjoy the view from the bottom. Julian and the bleeding guard retreated just as a nurse burst in. Arthur dropped the scalpel, his hand shaking so violently it clattered against the bed rail. He collapsed back against the pillows, his vision swimming in a sea of gray. Hours later, or perhaps days, time had become a fluid, treacherous thing. A janitor entered the room. He was a small man with thick-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He began mopping the floor with a rhythmic, heavy sigh. Arthur watched him through half-closed lids. The janitor moved closer to the bed, his movements too precise, too focused for someone cleaning floors. The coffee in the cafeteria, the janitor whispered, not looking up. It's 145 degrees, scalding, unacceptable. Arthur's eyes snapped open. Michael? Michael Davis, the fired CFO, looked up. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot behind his glasses. He reached into his jumpsuit and pulled out a small, cheap burner phone and a silver flash drive. They've got the board in their pocket, Arthur, Michael said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. But Julian is sloppy. He's using a shell company called Acheron to move the Gary plant assets. It's money laundering, plain and simple. I've got the logs on this drive. Arthur took the phone, the plastic feeling cheap and flimsy compared to the custom devices he was used to. How did you get in here? I know the service elevators better than the security teams do, Michael said, dipping a digital thermometer into Arthur's water glass. 138 degrees, Safe. He took a deep breath. Arthur, we have to move. The shareholder meeting is tomorrow morning. Julian is going to present a forged medical affidavit saying you've lost your mind. If that passes, it's over. Arthur gripped the burner phone. A glimmer of hope, real and sharp, pierced through the fog of his pain. We leak it. We give it to the SEC. We burn him down. He'll see it coming, Michael warned. He's watching the wires. Arthur watched as his oldest friend struggled for air, his glasses falling to the floor and shattering. The sight of Michael, exhausted, broken, yet still trying to save a legacy that wasn't even his, triggered something in Arthur. A surge of protective rage that bypassed his failing kidneys and his torn stitches. Arthur didn't count the steps. He didn't think about the rhythm. He threw himself from the bed. The pain was a white-hot explosion in his side. He felt the stitches pop, felt the warm rush of blood soaking his gown. But he didn't stop. He used his entire body weight, a skeletal, dying force, and slammed into Julian's side. They both crashed into the medical monitors. Glass shattered. Sparks erupted as a heavy screen fell, its internal components shrieking as they died. Arthur pinned Julian against the wreckage, his fingers clawing at his brother's expensive lapels. "Run!" Arthur screamed at Michael. "Get to the SEC, run!" Michael didn't hesitate. He scooped up the drive, dodged the startled guard, and vanished into the hallway. Julian snarled, shoving Arthur off him. Arthur hit the floor, his vision blurring, the smell of scorched dust and blood filling his nostrils. He looked up at Julian, who was straightening his tie, his face contorted with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You think that matters?" Julian spat. "You think a few spreadsheets will stop me? Look at you, Arthur. You're bleeding out on a hospital floor. You're dying." Julian knelt down, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the sound of the alarms. "Here's the part you didn't calculate, brother. That kidney? It's healthy, but your body is trying to kill it. You need a very specific drug to keep it from rotting inside you. Cyclo-S. It's rare, it's expensive. And as of 3 hours ago, my shell company, Acheron, owns the only patent and the entire North American supply." Julian smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. "If you use that data, if you stop the merger, I'll stop the pills. You'll be dead within 48 hours, and your legacy will be a bankrupt estate tied up in probate for a decade. So, what's it going to be, Arthur? Your life or your pride?" Arthur lay in the pool of his own blood, the cold linoleum pressing against his cheek. He looked at the burner phone, still clutched in his hand. The ultimatum was perfect. It was a closed loop, a mathematical certainty of defeat. Julian stood up, brushing dust from his sleeves. "I'll give you an hour to decide. Don't bother calling for help. The guards outside are on my payroll now." Julian walked out, leaving Arthur alone in the wreckage of the room. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of the struggle. Arthur looked at his wrist. His pulse was fast, thready. 1, 2, 3. He thought of his father. He thought of the Gary plant. He thought of the 4,000 people who would lose their livelihoods so Julian could buy a bigger yacht. He thought of Sarah's betrayal and Michael's broken glasses. He realized then that he had spent his whole life trying to control the rhythm of his death. He had counted his steps, monitored his heart, and managed his empire as if precision could ward off the inevitable. But the rhythm was already gone. He picked up the burner phone. His fingers were slippery with blood, but his mind was clear. He didn't call the SEC. He didn't call the board. He called Jennifer Martinez, the FBI agent who had been circling the Sterling case for months. "Agent Martinez," Arthur rasped into the phone. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I'm calling to report a crime, not one, all of them." He began to talk. He gave her the account numbers. He gave her the names of the shell companies. He told her about the drug blackmail, the insider trading, and the private equity firm Julian was fronting for. He knew that by doing this, he was triggering a federal freeze on all Sterling assets. He was destroying his own fortune. He was making himself personally liable for billions in damages. He was, effectively, signing his own death warrant. But as he spoke, he felt a strange, light sensation in his chest. For the first time in 40 years, he wasn't counting. The FBI swarmed the hospital 20 minutes later. The sound of heavy boots and barked orders echoed through the halls. Arthur watched from his bed as they cornered Julian in the hallway. There was no struggle this time. Julian looked at the agents, then at Arthur through the glass. The predatory grin was gone, replaced by the hollow, panicked look of a man who had finally run out of moves. "You're a fool," Julian screamed as they cuffed him. "You've lost everything. You're a pauper." Arthur didn't respond. He watched as they led his brother away, the charcoal suit looking crumpled and cheap in the harsh fluorescent light. The aftermath was a slow, quiet collapse. The Sterling empire didn't fall with a bang. It dissolved into a sea of legal filings and bankruptcy hearings. The stock price hit zero. The towers were sold to pay the creditors. The Sterling name was stripped from the skyline. 2 months later, Arthur Sterling walked out of a public hospital in Chicago. He was thinner, his hair completely white, and he moved with a slight limp. He didn't have a driver waiting for him. He didn't have a tailored suit. He wore a pair of cheap jeans and a gray sweatshirt. He stood on the sidewalk, the wind from the lake biting at his face. Across the street, workers were using a crane to remove the giant brass S from the top of the Sterling building. It swung in the air, a heavy, meaningless piece of metal. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out his bus fare. He looked at his wrist. He wasn't wearing a watch. He didn't check his pulse. He walked to the bus stop, his steps steady and unhurried. He didn't count them. He just walked. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. Arthur climbed aboard and took a seat by the window. As the city blurred past, he watched the people on the street. The mothers with strollers, the construction workers, the students. They weren't line items. They weren't variables. They were just people, living in the rhythm of a world he was finally, truly a part of. He was a man who owned nothing but his name. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. The bus pulled away from the curb, moving into the flow of traffic, heading toward a future that had no numbers, no spreadsheets, and no end in sight. Arthur leaned his head against the cool glass and closed his eyes, listening to the steady, uncounted beating of his own heart. The end